Imagine fighting a war where the enemy can appear from anywhere, the jungle, the tunnels beneath your feet, or even the village next to you. This was the terrifying reality of the Vietnam War. To truly understand this brutal conflict, you have to go back to the end of World War II. You see, the story doesn't begin with a gunshot, but with something much quieter, the stroke of a pen. A single line drawn on a map that would slice a nation in two and sow the seeds for a devastating war that would last for decades.
So here's how that split looked on the ground. Up in the north, you had a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh, and down in the south, a non-communist government, and this is key, supported by the United States. So you've got this nation just split in two by ideology. It was like a political fault line, And the pressure along that line, well, it was building.
So that begs the question, right? Why did the United States get so deeply involved? Well, it all came down to this one really powerful idea. They called it the domino theory. And the fear was, it was a very real fear, that as South Vietnam fell to communism, it wouldn't just stop there. It would set off a chain reaction. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, they believed all of them would fall, one right after the other, just like dominoes. So for the people making decisions back in Washington, this was never just about Vietnam. It was about the future of all of Southeast Asia. And it was that very fear that pushed America headfirst into the next chapter. But this wasn't going to be a war like the ones they knew. There were no clear front lines, no familiar battlefields. This was the Jungle War, a totally different kind of combat. It was terrifying, disorienting, and it was about to test the limits of every single soldier sent there.
The escalation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost deceptive. It started small, back in the early 50s, with just a few American military advisors sent to support South Vietnam. But by 1965, that trickle had turned into a flood. That's when we see the deployment of thousands of American combat troops. And by the late 60s, those troop levels had hit their absolute peak.
And the sheer scale of this, it's just hard to wrap your head around. Over the entire course of the war, more than 3 million Americans served in Vietnam. Think about that. 3 million. An entire generation of young men sent to the other side of the planet to fight in a war that was getting more confusing and more dangerous with every passing day.
So what did they find when they got there? It wasn't a conventional army waiting for them. It was something else entirely. An elusive, almost ghostly enemy. They were called the Viet Cong. These were guerrilla fighters from the south, allied with the north, and they knew the jungle like the back of their hand. They used guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, booby traps, and they operated from this vast, incredible network of underground tunnels. The battlefield? Well, it wasn't a line on a map. It was everywhere, and it was nowhere, all at the same time. For years, the American public was being told the same thing over and over. We're winning. They kept hearing about the light at the end of the tunnel. But then came 1968, and in 1968, that whole illusion was just shattered. One single, massive, coordinated attack would change not just the course of the war, but how everyone saw it, forever. It all happened during the Tet holiday, which was supposed to be a ceasefire. But instead of peace, the entire country just exploded into war. In a stunningly coordinated surprise attack, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces hit cities and military bases all across South Vietnam at the exact same time. The fighting was so intense it even spilled over the walls of the American embassy in Saigon. And that was a hugely symbolic and deeply shocking blow. Now, on paper, from a purely military standpoint, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces pushed them back. They won the battle. But the psychological damage, that was done. It was irreversible, because the Tet Offensive proved, without a doubt, that the enemy was far from beaten. They were stronger, more organized, and more determined than anyone back home had been led to believe. And for the very first time, a really tough question started to hang in the air back in America. Could this war even be won? And that one question, that really marked the beginning of the end. After the Tet Offensive, the entire conversation about the war changed. It wasn't about escalating anymore. It wasn't about sending more troops. The new reality was about how to get out. And that process would be long, painful, and it would tear America apart. Because while the war was being fought in the jungles of Vietnam, another war was raging right back home in the United States. The anti-war movement, which had been simmering for a while, just exploded. It swelled into a roar, with huge protests in the streets demanding an end to it all. And every single night, the TV news was bringing the brutal reality of the war right into people's living rooms. And as the casualties kept rising, the country's will to fight just started to crumble. So the end didn't come quickly.
It was a long, slow, painful process. In the early 1970s, the U.S. finally began to systematically pull its troops out. Then, in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. That officially ended America's direct military role. But the fighting in Vietnam didn't stop. And 2 years later, in 1975, the world watched as North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon. The war was at last over. But just because the fighting stopped doesn't mean the story was over. Not by a long shot. What the war left behind was a legacy of absolute devastation and scars, both physical and psychological, that would affect millions of people for generations to come.
And the human cost, it's just staggering. We're talking about millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers killed. Tens of thousands of American soldiers killed. Entire cities and villages were left in ruins. But beyond the numbers, the war left its profound mark. It completely changed how America and the world viewed the very idea of military intervention.
And maybe that's the real legacy of it all. Even today, all these decades later, the Vietnam War serves as this powerful, haunting lesson. A lesson about the true human cost of conflict and about the incredible complexities of war. Complexities that just don't have easy answers or simple victories.